Well, speaking of people on the right side of politics not agreeing on everything, holy cow, did that Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin stir things up or what? I'm all for Tucker, a big fan, and he has every right to interview Putin. All that hoo-ha from the cancel culture, censorship-loving modern left in the US saying that he shouldn't even be doing the interview was just ridiculous. Plenty of dictators and authoritarian leaders have been interviewed by Western journalists over the decades. But personally, and here's where you might disagree, I really am a bit worried about how fast some conservatives have decided that Vlad is a good bloke all of a sudden. He isn't. He's a murdering big government, big state, centralised control, authoritarian dictator commie. He's not a nice bloke. Just because we don't like Biden and the corruption around Ukraine, and we might be sceptical of the motives of the US and the CIA and the deep state bureaucrats and the military-industrial complex, does not mean we should start thinking Vladimir Putin is some kind of hero. He knows what we're thinking, and he's playing us. Here's how the BBC saw it.
Vladimir Putin was asked by Carlson whether he'd invade a NATO country such as Poland.
Can you imagine a scenario where you sent Russian troops to Poland?
Only in one case, if Poland attacks Russia. Why? Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that? We simply don't have any interest.
Now that's important because Putin's expansionist intentions are the core of why Ukraine's leaders in Kiev want to join NATO, get closer to the West, and separate the country more from Russia. That pivot to the West is what sparked Putin's invasion almost 2 years ago. Look, let's be clear. Tucker Carlson didn't set up an interview with Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin decided he wanted to address Americans, particularly conservative Americans, and he chose to do it through Tucker Carlson. And good on Tucker for jumping at the opportunity. Nothing wrong with that. The Democrats and the US mainstream media's ridicule of Carlson for speaking with the dictator was dumb, and it played right into Putin's hands. It amplified Putin's preferred narrative, that he's the victim of some kind of conspiracy of censorship, a misunderstood leader being silenced by the evil deep state of the USA. Given the state of America right now, this narrative plays into some hard truths. The US is a nation that does have a kind of deep state bureaucratic and legal class that's operating more politically than they should, in a manner that's out of touch with the people and their elected representatives. The country's once fairly objective legal system and police enforcement have descended into a machine of political lawfare with a glaring hypocrisy between the get Trump at any cost mentality and the protect Biden at any cost mentality. Trust in the mainstream media has never been lower, and with very good reason. The American landscape is ripe for Putin to play his hand and push his false victim narrative. Putin knows the cynicism with which conservatives and libertarians in America now view their own government. So who better to give the big interview to than the man who symbolises this giant middle finger to the establishment? The rebel who was apparently axed by his own conservative network for speaking truth to power too often, Tucker Carlson.
Our senior United States senators from the state of New York, Chuck Schumer, said yesterday, I believe, that we have to continue to fund the Ukrainian effort or U.S. soldiers, citizens could wind up fighting there. How do you assess that?
Well, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of very serious global conflict. This is obvious. Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia? Make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today, realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end?
Oh, he's good. Did you hear the embedded threat there right at the end? That was a perfectly pitched message right to the heart of the MAGA conservatives in America. Using Tucker Carlson isn't surprising. using the format of a podcast-length interview also isn't surprising. But why has Putin chosen to do this now? Well, both Moscow and Kiev now want to end this war, but neither wants to lose it or be seen to be losing it. As the second anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine approaches and winter abates, it's time for some jaw before resuming the war. An estimated 500,000 people have been killed. Accurate data is difficult to come by. Analysts generally agree that Russia has borne 300,000 of those deaths, Ukraine roughly 200,000, mostly men, of course. Given Ukraine's population sits around 44 million, that's getting close to 1 in 100 of the country's men, an horrific human toll. It's fair to assume that Putin never expected Ukraine to put up such a noble fight. He's managed to escape embarrassment thanks to a combination of cunning and good luck. Analysis by the University of Sydney Professor Emeritus Graham Gill, who's an expert on Russia and Soviet history, says early predictions that sanctions would wreck the Russian economy proved to be false.
In the first year of the war, 2022, the Russian economy shrank by about 2%. Ukrainian economy shrank by 22%, according to some estimates. According to other estimates, it was 45%, but the Russian economy appears to have shrunk by about 2%.
Professor Gill says there have been very few food shortages in Russia and certainly no bread lines in the streets. Western firms have exited, but their departure has been an economic stimulus to domestic production in many cases, and where local workers haven't been able to fill the gaps, imports from the global south and China have. As is typical in times of war, unemployment is pretty low, negligible in fact. Oil and gas revenues in 2022 flowed into Russia at almost the same level as before. And increased government wartime spending out of Russia's substantial savings reserves from its large sovereign wealth fund have also proven to be an economic bonus. Ironically, decades of sanctions leading up to the war have made the Russian economy less dependent on the West and quite resilient, thank you very much. But Putin's luck may be starting to run out. Unlike 2022, oil and gas reserves halved in 2023. The sovereign wealth fund piggy bank is now more depleted, and inflation is on the march.
But the message to leave you with is that the economy has not suffered the sort of consequences that it was thought that it would, and that it has been able to sustain the Russian war effort. And I suspect it's likely to be able to do that for some time into the future.
Professor Gill says the picture is even more grim for Ukraine. Resources, both in terms of equipment and manpower, are hard to come by. The US, Poland and Slovakia are all winding back support for Ukraine, and the country is running out of soldiers. Whatever the strategic battlefield analysis, both countries have a lot to lose from a continued fight. And let's face it, brutal war between so-called civilised developed nations in Eastern Europe in the 21st century has really got a childish and foolish ring to it. An example of ego and immaturity and poor strategy that's truly an embarrassment and disgrace to both nations and their leadership and the United Nations. The unbecoming barbarism of uncivilised gangsters. Putin's concerns about NATO expansionism, EU expansionism and Russian isolation used to justify his February invasion in 2022 simply failed to do so. Ukraine, as a sovereign state, has every right to join any regional bloc it wants to. Russia can line defensive forces along the border in response, if it so wants, but crossing that border is not a right it possesses. Hence, Putin spending half an hour on a questionable, boring history lesson at the start of the interview trying to justify Russia's historic entitlement to modern Ukraine. The BBC says this is familiar ground for Putin. It was an infamous 2021 essay that he wrote called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians that first formed his intellectual justification for the invasion. Historians say the litany of claims made by Mr. Putin are nonsense, representing nothing more than a selective abuse of history to justify the ongoing war in Ukraine, the BBC and New Statesman's Europe correspondent Ido Vok writes. More importantly, Vok notes that regardless of the historical realities, none of Putin's assertions would form a legal justification for his invasion. It seems Putin's overarching main message from his decision to engage the US public through Tucker Carlson is this: we are not expansionist aggressors. We invaded Ukraine because we were provoked by breaches of the Minsk Treaty of 2014, and the part of Ukraine that we want is really Russian anyway. Putin wants a negotiated end to this war, and this is him laying out his opening case in that negotiation. We should remain highly sceptical. Make sure you do follow us on X, Twitter, at OtherSideAus, AUS. We'd love to have your engagement right throughout the week. Tucker Carlson told his viewers after the interview that they'd have to be idiots to think that Russia was expansionist, but he should probably be a lot slower to accept a former KGB agent's sincerity. Russia has recently taken Transnistria from Moldova, South Ossetia and Abkhazia from Georgia, and now he's invaded Ukraine to support the separatists of the self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. Like most conflicts, this all comes down to whether you think history lessons tell us much about who is morally entitled to what and why, or whether you think that what really matters is what the majority of people living in any particular region want today. The latter would appear to have more chance of bringing long-term peace, it would seem. Claims of control from faraway cities like Moscow or even Kiev are rarely welcome in any battle for local autonomy. But Putin is trying to make both the historical and the present moment arguments. As always, it's not the rational performance that will carry most weight, but the human and emotional one. And on that front, Putin has chosen the right vehicle in Tucker Carlson to make his lengthy address to America. He's achieved his goal of seeming disarming and non-aggressive, and he's added weight to his own arguments, albeit through a considerably skewed and subjective interpretation of both history and more recent events. Carlson, on the other hand, has demonstrated that however good he might be as a storyteller and presenter, and I can tell you as a professional he is really, really good, but his long-form interview style is nowhere near challenging enough. While an interviewer will destroy an interview if they constantly interrupt and challenge every point, it's often best to let the interviewee demonstrate their own foolishness sometimes by just staying silent. Polite, firm challenge every now and again is the hallmark of a good interview, and there was plenty for Carlson to challenge that he did not. One high-profile Conservative who utterly slammed Carlson's performance was UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, probably because he was quite unhappy with this bit of the interview.
You're saying you want a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine.
Right. And we made it. We prepared a huge document in Istanbul that was initialed by the head of the Ukrainian delegation. He affixed his signature to some of the provisions, not to all of it. He put his signature and then he himself said, "We were ready to sign it and the war would have been over long ago, 18 months ago. However, Prime Minister Johnson came, talked us out of it, and we missed that chance."
Now, in a furious response editorial in the UK's The Daily Mail newspaper, former Prime Minister Johnson said, quote, "As every member of the Ukrainian government will confirm from Zelensky down, nothing and no one could have stopped those lion-hearted Ukrainians from fighting for their country, and nothing will." Describing Carlson's performance as bum-sucking civility to a tyrant, Johnson wrote that he didn't ask Putin why even now he's using the most brutal means of modern warfare to maim and murder innocent Ukrainian civilians. He didn't take him to task for the torture, the rapes, the blowing up of kindergartens. The Russian leader chose to invade a sovereign and independent European country with no justification other than his arrogant desire to crush that country and rebuild the Soviet Union. He called on Conservatives not to fall for Putin's lies. You are the heirs of Ronald Reagan. You cannot make America great again by selling out Ukraine and allowing Putin to use violence to rebuild the Soviet empire. By investing only a fraction of the US defense budget, you can help those valiant Ukrainians to turn the tide, put Putin back in his box, and help secure the Euro-Atlantic area for a generation without risking a single US soldier. It's right for Americans and Europeans to be sceptical of the motives of their own leaders at this time. The tough guy exuberance for a fight shown by the Biden administration, the Biden family's own questionable connections to Ukraine, and the seeming unwillingness to seek a negotiated peace are all cause for concern. But Johnson is ultimately probably right. Conservatives must never make a hero of Vladimir Putin, a man who is every bit the murderous tyrant, communist dictator and centralised state control freak, the very worst of the anti-freedom leftist elites against whom we battle daily. And he's a master manipulator.